Mark Whitmore stood beside his wife's coffin, stoic and composed, while Brianna, Eliza's younger sister, wept softly by his side. Just 2 days later, the same man was seen checking into a hotel with the same grieving sister. What really happened behind the doors of the Whitmore home, and was Eliza's death truly an accident, or the perfect beginning to a carefully planned betrayal? Mark and Eliza Whitmore were the kind of couple that made others envious. Their white-painted colonial house sat on the corner of a manicured cul-de-sac in Arlington, Virginia, with rose bushes that bloomed even when the weather tried to disagree. Neighbors often described them as storybook perfect. Mark was a well-respected civil engineer who left for work every morning in crisp shirts and polished shoes. Eliza ran a boutique downtown that specialized in handmade accessories, where customers often stopped by just to chat. Their marriage seemed untouchable, solid, balanced, and quietly admirable. For those looking in from the outside, there was no reason to think anything was wrong. The Whitmores hosted barbecues in the summer, sent out beautifully designed holiday cards in December, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to one another. Mark brought Eliza flowers just because. Eliza kept Mark's coffee exactly the way he liked it. 2 sugars, no cream, ready every morning. To the average eye, they were perfect. Brianna, Eliza's younger sister, was a regular fixture in their lives. In her mid-20s, she had recently finished graduate school and was staying with the Whitmores while she searched for work and a place of her own. She and Eliza were incredibly close, the kind of sisters who shared everything: secrets, clothes, even sometimes finishing each other's sentences. Brianna had always looked up to her older sister, and Eliza seemed to enjoy doting on her in return. There was nothing strange about Brianna being in the house, and nothing strange about Mark occasionally helping her with job applications or giving advice about budgeting. Everything appeared above board. But as the weeks went by, a subtle shift began to occur, one that only the most observant would have caught: a lingering glance here, an awkward silence there. Moments passed between Mark and Brianna that didn't belong, but no one noticed, or if they did, they chose not to say anything. Then came the morning of October 22nd. It was a Sunday, cool, gray, and still, the kind of morning that felt like it was holding its breath. The housekeeper arrived at 9:00 a.m. like she always did, only to find something she could never unsee. Eliza was in the bathtub. The water had gone cold. Her eyes were open but lifeless, her skin pale. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no disarray, just silence and the soft hum of a house that no longer felt like home. The initial assumption was simple: an accident. Maybe she slipped while trying to get out. Maybe she fainted. The coroner's early findings supported this theory. No trauma, no indication of force. The police ruled it as an accidental drowning, and within 48 hours the file was closed. Her death certificate was issued. The funeral was scheduled. Mark was the picture of a grieving husband. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his voice cracked under the weight of emotion. At the service, he clutched Eliza's photograph with trembling hands. Friends and family offered condolences, expressing disbelief at how something so tragic could happen so suddenly. Brianna, seated beside Mark in the front pew, wept quietly, her face buried in a tissue. But even amidst the solemn ceremony, some couldn't help but notice the closeness between them. Not overt, but present. The way their shoulders brushed as they stood. The way Mark reached for her hand when they walked away from the gravesite. It could have been interpreted as shared grief. 2 people mourning the same loss, bound by love for the same woman. And yet, 2 days later, Mark would check into a roadside hotel under a false name. And he wouldn't be alone. The news would break quietly at first, a receptionist recognizing a face in a newspaper, a journalist asking questions, a grainy video clip from a hallway camera. But the image was unmistakable. Mark, with Brianna, entering a room to what happened in that house. What really caused Eliza's death, and how long had something been hiding beneath the surface of that perfect life? The answers were coming, but no one was prepared for what they would reveal. It started with a hunch, the kind that crawls under the skin and refuses to let go. Angela Marsh had worked the front desk at the Delacroix Inn for nearly 10 years. Nothing much happened there. Business travelers, passing couples, and the occasional family on a budget road trip. It was the kind of place that offered clean sheets, weak coffee, and anonymity. But on the evening of October 26th, something about the man who checked in under the name David Wells nagged at her. He was polite, well-groomed, and clearly not new to the idea of discretion. He avoided eye contact, paid in cash, and requested a room at the far end of the hallway. Moments later, a woman joined him, young, striking, and familiar, not from the hotel, but from somewhere else. Angela couldn't place her right away, but her instinct flickered. Something didn't feel right. She mentioned it to the night staff in passing, but no one gave it a second thought. It was just another guest. Another late check-in. 3 days later, Angela was flipping through the local paper during a slow shift. Page 7 held a small article. Local woman drowns in bathtub. Ruled accidental. It featured a photo of Eliza Whitmore smiling beside her husband. Angela blinked. Her heart stuttered. She recognized the man immediately. It was David Wells. And the woman he'd arrived with that night? She wasn't the one in the photograph. But she looked eerily similar. Angela didn't sleep that night. She re-watched the security footage, the way she had hundreds of times before in dull moments of boredom, but this time with sharp focus. There he was. Mark Whitmore. He wore a baseball cap low on his forehead, but it wasn't enough. She saw the way he glanced around the lobby before stepping inside, and then the woman appeared. No cap, no effort to hide. Her long hair fell over one shoulder, and when she turned her face toward the camera, Angela paused the footage. It was Eliza's sister, Brianna. The discovery crawled through her brain like wildfire. 2 days after his wife's funeral, Mark Whitmore had checked into a hotel with her sister. Not a week, not a month, 2 days. The article had made no mention of foul play, but the timing didn't sit right. Angela didn't want to get involved. She wasn't the kind of person who stirred trouble. But this wasn't just gossip. This was something else. She made a quiet phone call to a local investigative journalist known for poking into stories that didn't sit well with the public. She sent the surveillance tape, the booking information, and the newspaper clipping. The journalist called back within an hour. Her voice was calm but urgent. She'd look into it. Angela never saw Mark Whitmore again. Carla traced the life insurance policy first. A quick search revealed that Mark had filed a $500,000 0-cents claim just days after Eliza's death. The policy had been taken out less than a month earlier. That alone wasn't evidence, but it was enough to set off alarms. She then checked Brianna's public social media profiles. They had all been deactivated within 24 hours of the funeral. Clean wipe. No updates, no posts, just gone. The hotel footage began circulating quietly between journalists and eventually landed in the hands of the local police. The case, once labeled an unfortunate household accident, was reopened quietly, without fanfare. No press releases, no public statements, just silent suspicion and new questions. Why was Mark using an alias? Why was he at a hotel with Brianna days after burying his wife? And most disturbingly of all, was Eliza's death really an accident, or had it been carefully staged to look like one? Answers began to unravel in whispers, and with each one, the perfect facade of the Whitmore family began to crumble. Something had gone very wrong in that house, and now the truth was starting to surface. When the case was reopened, it didn't begin with sirens or bold accusations. It began in silence, private meetings, quiet phone calls, and discreet reviews of old evidence. The police weren't ready to declare Eliza Whitmore's death a murder, but the hotel footage had stirred enough unease that they could no longer ignore the inconsistencies. The autopsy report was pulled from the archives. At first glance, it still appeared routine. Accidental drowning, no significant trauma, minor bruising consistent with a fall. But when a second, independent pathologist took a closer look, things started to shift. The bruises around Eliza's neck weren't as superficial as first thought. They were faint, yes, but too uniform for a simple fall. More disturbingly, a more detailed toxicology screen, requested only now, detected a trace amount of a powerful sedative, not enough to kill her outright, but more than enough to render her unconscious in a bathtub. It had been missed the first time, or perhaps overlooked. Now it changed everything. Detectives returned to the Whitmore home under the guise of following up. They weren't ready to tip their hand to Mark or Brianna just yet. They needed more. A laptop recovered from Mark's home office was analyzed. Hidden in a folder buried 3 directories deep were search queries that painted a haunting picture: how to make a death look accidental, sedatives that don't show up in autopsies, and life insurance payout after spouse dies. The searches spanned weeks, starting shortly before the policy was purchased, but perhaps the most chilling discovery came from Brianna. She had moved out of the Whitmore home shortly after the funeral, returning to her mother's house in a neighboring county. When police interviewed her, she seemed fragile. Her eyes were puffy and red, and her hands trembled. They didn't need to press hard. Her guilt spilled out in fragments. She admitted that she and Mark had been having an affair. It had begun innocently, she claimed. Just late-night conversations when Eliza was asleep, then secret text messages, then meetings outside the house. It escalated quickly. Mark told her he was unhappy, that Eliza had changed, that he felt trapped in a loveless marriage. Brianna said she was drawn in by his vulnerability, convinced that they were both victims of a woman who didn't understand them. But she hadn't known about the life insurance policy until after Eliza was dead. Brianna insisted she had nothing to do with Eliza's death. According to her, she had believed Mark's grief was real. He had broken down in her arms after the funeral. He said he couldn't bear to be alone, that he needed her. She said she went to the hotel because she thought they were starting over. She never expected to see the footage on the news later. She had no idea anyone else knew. Investigators found her story convenient, but incomplete. Brianna had deleted every message between her and Mark, claiming she wanted to move on, but forensic experts retrieved fragments from backups. The texts were suggestive and emotional. Mark had written things like, "Soon it'll just be us," and "Trust me, everything will fall into place." There were no direct confessions, but the tone was foreboding. It wasn't love. It was a plan. A neighbor's home security camera offered one final blow. Though Mark told police he had been out of town the night before Eliza's death, the footage showed him arriving home in the middle of the night, staying for several hours, and then leaving before dawn. He had lied. Not once. Not by accident. He had crafted an alibi, assuming no one would check. By now, detectives were no longer asking if Eliza was murdered. They were asking how, why, and who would crack first, and they knew Mark was running out of time. The pieces were falling into place, but the full picture was darker than anyone had expected. Behind the polished exterior of Mark Whitmore's life was a carefully constructed lie, one built not in a moment of madness, but brick by brick, over time. His clean-cut image, his composed demeanor at the funeral, even his silence during the initial investigation, were not signs of grief. They were the hallmarks of control. Detectives retraced his movements on the day Eliza died. The timeline he had given was tight. He claimed to have been on site at a construction project in Charlottesville all day, 100 miles from home, but records didn't back that up. The company vehicle tracker showed long gaps in his whereabouts. Cell tower data told a different story. At 2:13 a.m., Mark's phone had pinged a tower just 5 miles from his home. At 2:31 a.m., he turned off the device entirely. It remained dark until 7:45 a.m., when it suddenly came back online, miles away back on the highway. That alone was enough to raise red flags. But investigators wanted more than suspicion. They needed proof. Fortunes went back into the Whitmore residence, this time with a court order to swab the bathroom for traces of the sedative found in Eliza's system. Beneath the edge of the vanity, embedded in a towel that had fallen between the cabinet and the wall, was a faint, sticky residue. The lab results confirmed it contained the same compound found in her toxicology report. It had been administered at home, likely mixed into a drink or applied directly to her skin through a transdermal gel. Eliza had no prescription for such a substance, but a local pharmacy's records showed that a similar compound had been filled under a business account belonging to one of Mark's former construction clients. The signature was digital. It was difficult to trace, but not impossible. A technician compared the digital handwriting to Mark's known signature. The match wasn't just close, it was exact. And yet, as the net tightened around him, Mark was nowhere to be found. When detectives returned to question him further, they discovered the Whitmore house was empty. His car was gone. His phone was turned off. Brianna claimed not to have heard from him since the hotel incident had surfaced publicly. Her voice cracked when she said his name. Whether out of heartbreak or fear, no one could tell. The search for Mark began quietly, then expanded quickly. His bank accounts had been drained over several weeks through small, undetectable withdrawals. A passport was missing from a locked drawer in his home office. Cameras from a Greyhound station in Richmond caught someone matching his description boarding a bus 2 days before the warrant for his arrest was issued. But the trail ended there. Meanwhile, his name dominated headlines. Reporters latched onto the story of the man who had buried his wife and checked into a hotel with her sister 2 days later. Eliza's death was no longer seen as a tragic accident. It had become a puzzle, one that the public was desperate to solve. Family and friends were horrified. Those who had stood by Mark at the funeral now spoke in hushed tones, questioning what they had missed. Eliza's parents released a short statement through their attorney. "We believe justice is coming. Our daughter deserves the truth." But for investigators, justice was slipping through their fingers. They had evidence, motive, and a growing mountain of circumstantial proof, but without Mark, the case stalled. Warrants were issued, alerts were sent to airports and border crossings. Still, he vanished like smoke in the wind. Every day that passed without him raised more questions. Had he planned the escape all along? Was someone helping him? Or had he gone into hiding, waiting for the noise to die down? One thing was clear: the perfect husband had become the prime suspect in a crime that now felt anything but accidental. 6 weeks had passed since Mark Whitmore disappeared, and with each day the story grew colder and stranger. Media attention, once relentless, had begun to shift. New scandals, new tragedies, new headlines. But for those who had followed the case from the beginning, the absence of a resolution was more disturbing than any revelation. Mark had simply vanished, leaving behind a trail of deception, betrayal, and unanswered questions. Then, out of nowhere, an anonymous tip came in. A man matching Mark's description had been spotted in a small coastal town in Maine. He was living under the name Greg Thompson, working odd jobs at a local marina and renting a tiny cottage near the water. The tipster provided photos, grainy but clear enough. It was him. Federal marshals moved in swiftly, surrounding the cottage before sunrise. There was no dramatic escape attempt. No resistance. Mark opened the door slowly, looked at the officers, and said only one thing: "I knew you'd come eventually." His arrest sent shockwaves through the public. After weeks of silence, a face that had become almost mythic was once again front and center. But this time, he wasn't in a crisp suit beside his wife. He was in handcuffs, under harsh fluorescent lights, being booked for first-degree murder. In the days that followed, new evidence came to light. Documents Mark had tried to destroy before disappearing. Recovered from a hidden hard drive in his home office was a digital journal he had kept for nearly a year. Within its pages were carefully detailed entries, his frustrations with Eliza, his growing obsession with Brianna, and his thoughts on how to end his marriage without financial ruin. One entry, dated just 3 weeks before Eliza's death, read, "If she's gone, everything changes. I'd be free. I could start over, with someone who understands me." The trial was set to be one of the most watched in recent memory. Prosecutors built their case with precision, presenting the digital evidence, the toxicology findings, the hotel footage, and the suspicious life insurance policy. They painted Mark as a man who saw a murder not as a desperate act, but as a solution, cold, calculated, deliberate. The defense was prepared. They argued that Eliza's death was still accidental, that the sedative could have been taken unknowingly, perhaps a mix-up with medications. They said the affair with Brianna, while inappropriate, had no bearing on Eliza's death. They framed Mark as a grieving husband who made poor choices, not a killer. Brianna was called to testify. Her appearance in court was haunting. She wore black, her voice shaky, her eyes red. She recounted her relationship with Mark in painful detail, admitting to the affair but denying any knowledge of a murder plot. When asked if she believed Mark had killed her sister, she hesitated for a long moment, then said, "I didn't want to believe it, but now I don't know who he really was." After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. Guilty of first-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to defraud, Mark showed no emotion. He simply nodded, as if he had already accepted his fate. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Outside the courtroom, Eliza's parents embraced quietly. There were no tears left to cry, just the knowledge that the truth had finally surfaced, no matter how ugly it was. In the weeks that followed, the house on the corner of the quiet cul-de-sac was sold. The rose bushes withered and were uprooted. Brianna left town, her whereabouts unknown. And though justice had been served, a lingering shadow remained, a reminder that even the most perfect lives can hide the darkest secrets, and that love, when twisted by obsession and deceit, can become something terrifying.